This is figure 27.1, which shows the two variables here being correlated, interest rate along the y-axis or vertical axis, and planned investment along the horizontal axis. So this is the investment, the behavior of investment with respect to interest rate. At a higher interest rate here at $9, 9%, sorry. At 9%, this is the level of investment. That is I sub 2. No, hindi ko masyadong mabasa. Anyway, at this level, no, this is the level of investment at this high interest rate. And at a lower, a little lower interest rate, this point, this is the level of investment. And at even lower interest rate, this is the investment now. An increase, no, greater investment at this level. So that is the relationship between interest rate and planned investment. As interest rate increases, the planned investment decreases. And as interest rate decreases, the planned investment increases. It's not only interest rate that determines planned investment. There are other factors, which is similar to consumption, which is not only dependent on income, but also on other factors. In the same manner, the firm will invest more or lesser based on other factors, not only on the interest rate. For example, the level of investment may be determined with respect to the expectations on future sales. And moreover, pessimism and optimism will also affect the investment level. Relevant to what has been said, there was a recent study by Simon Gilchrist and others who find that interest rates have a powerful effect on the behavior of firms. We can use the fact that planned investment depends on the interest rate to consider how planned aggregate expenditure depends on the interest rate. Meaning to say that planned investment depends on the interest rate, and aggregate expenditure includes investment. We recall that planned aggregate expenditure is the sum of these three kinds of spending: consumption spending of households, investment spending of businesses, and government spending, which include government spending includes purchases and purchases of goods and services. Okay, we recall this graph from chapter 3, which was about aggregate expenditure and aggregate income. Along the vertical axis is planned aggregate expenditure, and along the horizontal axis is aggregate output. The 45-degree line here divides aggregate expenditure and aggregate output into two equal parts. But then the real expenditure really begins at a positive level here. Okay, and this shows the level of expenditure in connection with the level of investment. Here, okay, it says here below, an increase in the interest rate from 3 to 6% lowers planned aggregate expenditure and thus reduces equilibrium income from Y sub O to Y sub 1. From Y sub 0 rather to Y sub 1. Okay, so initially, this is the aggregate expenditure. This is the level of aggregate expenditure at 6%. 6%. That's C plus I plus G. That's aggregate expenditure. And at 3%, this one, okay, this is the level of aggregate expenditure. C plus I sub O plus G. Um, Initially, this is the first, no? 3%, no? At 3% interest rate, this is the investment level, which is I sub O. And of course, I sub O or investment is included in the sum when you sum up the aggregate expenditure. It must be higher, no? And as we see the graph here, the aggregate expenditure graph is higher at this level because of the lower interest rate. But then at a higher interest rate of 6%, the investment will be lower and it affects the entire, the sum of aggregate expenditure. Thus, we see a decrease in the entire graph, no? The aggregate expenditure graph. And with this decrease in the aggregate expenditure, we see the shift in the equilibrium point from this level to that level. So this is the resulting equilibrium output when there was an increase in interest rate and therefore a decrease in investment spending. Okay, and that you see here we have Y sub 1, which is the aggregate output income. Thus, we see a decrease from Y sub O, no? This was the initial output before the increase in interest rate and the decrease therefore in investment. This is now the new output, the decrease in output because of the increase in interest rate and therefore a decrease in investment. And those points are summarized here. How, how the interest rate affects the investment and then eventually affecting the aggregate output. Okay, first, a high interest rate discourages planned investment. Planned investment is a part of planned aggregate expenditure. Thus, when the interest rate rises, planned aggregate expenditure at every level of income falls. Finally, a decrease in planned aggregate expenditure lowers equilibrium output income by a multiple of the initial decrease in planned investment. So there it is, no? It begins with increase in interest rate decreases the planned investment, which decreases the aggregate expenditure and therefore eventually decreases the output level, or rather the equilibrium output. And using a convenient shorthand, this is interest rate. Increase in interest rate decreases the investment, which decreases the aggregate expenditure and decreases the equilibrium output income. On the other hand, decrease in the interest rate leads to an increase in investment, which increases the aggregate expenditure and eventually increases the equilibrium output income. An increase in the interest rate decreases output Y in the goods market because an increase in R lowers planned investment. O, yun pa rin. When income increase, this shifts the money demand curve to the right. Okay, so this one now describes what happens to the money demand and the money supply. When income increases, this shifts the money demand curve to the right, which increases the interest rate with a fixed money supply. We can thus write increase in income increases the money demand, which increases the interest rate. On the other hand, decrease in output or income decreases the demand for money, which decreases the interest rate. So that this, we have here one, two, three. We have three variables here being interrelated. We have income, demand for money, and the interest rate. So these three, it begins with the output, but we see in the previous slides that it's the interest rate that affected the investment. The investment affected the aggregate expenditure, which affected the output. Now, this is the other half. Okay, so we had seen how the output was affected by initiating a change in the interest rate. Now, this is the other half. Affecting the output will now affect the money demand, affecting the interest rate. And then from the interest rate, what happens? Interest rate affecting the investment, investment affecting aggregate expenditure, aggregate expenditure affecting the aggregate income output. So it's like a cycle, or it's circular, no? Interest rate affecting investment, and then spending and output, then output affecting the money demand, then affecting interest rate. So it's via the money demand, that brings about the change in the interest rate from output to the demand for money, and then affecting interest rate. And this is assuming the money supply is constant. But if there's a change in the money supply, it's another story. Okay, so the assumption here is that money supply is constant. Okay, here we have goods market, which includes, we have here the aggregate output equal to aggregate spending, consumption, investment, and government. In the money market, it includes money demand and money supply. What is being shown here is how they are related. The goods market related to the money market. So you have, in this case, the money demand will increase or decrease depending on this Y, no? Increase or decrease in output affects the money demand. Okay, and the interaction between money demand and money supply determines the interest rate. And the interest rate, on the interest rate depends investment. And investment is part of aggregate expenditure. The aggregate expenditure affects the money demand. So, ganon. So, paikot-ikot siya. Planned investment depends on the interest rate, and the money demand depends on aggregate output, and aggregate output affects the aggregate income affecting the money demand affecting interest rate. Paikot-ikot lang talaga. Okay. Now we go to the policies of the government. There are two policies being used by the government to regulate the economy. So the government can stimulate the economy by stimulating spending or consumption, or dampen or slow down the economy by controlling or contracting spending and consumption. Okay. So we have two policies here, fiscal and monetary. These are the two major policies, fiscal and monetary. And under each fiscal and monetary, it's either expansionary or contractionary. Okay. Here, what are being presented are both expansionary fiscal and expansionary monetary. In expansionary fiscal policy, we see an increase in government spending or a reduction in net taxes. So both of these, or of course, These are not to be implemented simultaneously. The government will have to choose if it's government spending that will be affected, or that will be implemented, or if it will be a reduction in net taxes. But in either case, it is bound to increase the aggregate output. Okay? And then in the expansionary monetary, the aim is to increase money supply in order to increase aggregate output income. So, pareho yan, no? Uh, Expansionary, whether fiscal or monetary, are bound to increase economic activities through increasing production or output, and thereby increasing income. But then there is a crowding out effect when the government implements expansionary fiscal policy. Crowding effect means the tendency for increases in government spending to cause reductions in private spending. So the government spending affects private investment spending. In what way does it? Okay, so next slide we'll see how it is. An increase in government spending, which is denoted by G, from G sub O to G sub 1. Okay, ito yon. This is G sub O, and G sub O is part of aggregate spending, no, at this level. Okay, we see an increase in government spending here, G sub 1, that creates this graph. This is C plus I plus G sub 1. So that's an increase in government spending. Okay, then the crowding out effect of the decrease in planned investment brought about by the increased interest rate then shifts the planned aggregate expenditure schedule from 2 to 3. What was affected here? Okay. We see an increase in government spending here. Then again here. Here, spending. The government spending keeps increasing. But with this government spending increasing, there it brings about increase in the money supply actually. And with the increase in money supply, I think it's money supply, it affects, I'm sorry, I think the money supply here is constant, but there is a greater demand, no, a greater demand for nominal income. And the increase in nominal income, no, increases the demand for money. So with constant supply of money, the increase in demand for money increases the interest rate. So when there's an increase in the interest rate, it discourages more spending. I mean investment. No, as you had seen earlier, increase in the interest rate decreases investment spending. That's the crowding out effect. Okay, to summarize, increase in government spending increases the demand for money with money supply constant, which then increases the interest rate. The increase in interest rate reduces the investment spending. But it is not only interest rate that affects the investment spending. It really depends on the sensitivity of planned investment, which refers to the responsiveness of planned investment spending to changes in the interest rate. So it's not always the case that planned investment spending is sensitive to the interest rate. They may be, the investment spending may at one time be insensitive. Okay, do you see that point? Okay, let's look at this. The effects of an expansionary fiscal policy. Government spending increases increases income, increases money demand, increases the interest rate, and eventually or finally decreases investment. That's what I told you earlier. Okay. Here is expansionary monetary policy. The previous slide was about expansionary fiscal policy. Now this is expansionary monetary policy, which is about an increase in the money supply. As you had seen in the previous lecture about the increase in money supply is brought about by or through open market operations, discount rate, and required reserve ratio. No, those were the tools to effect uh, a change in the money supply. Okay, so by expansionary monetary policy, examples are decreasing the required reserve ratio, decreasing the discount rate, um, the buying back of government securities, no, like bonds or treasury bonds. Okay. Now here we have what is being shown here is the shorthand for the effects of an expansionary monetary policy. Increase in money supply decreases the interest rate, which increases the investment spending. Increases, no, the investment spending increases, thereby increasing the output income, thereby increasing the demand for money. Okay, so look at this, no? It begins with an increase in money supply and ends in an increase in money demand. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 variables which are interconnected, no? 5 variables interconnected, beginning with money supply, ending in money demand. So we see an increase in money supply, eventually ending with an increase in money demand via the interest rate, investment, and income output. Now here is our contractionary fiscal policy, which is either a decrease in government spending, okay, or an increase in net taxes. So either of these will decrease, no, the money supply, actually. Decrease in government spending, okay, and this will affect the money demand and the interest rate. So let's see how. Okay, so we see first the government spending decreasing or taxes being increased. Net taxes now increase. Okay, it's either government spending or increase in taxes, which decreases the output, which decreases the money demand, but decreases the interest rate, thereby increasing investment spending. Okay, see here, government spending decreases, and which finally, the bottom line, no, is increases the investment spending. Okay, now here, so the previous was contractionary fiscal. Now this is contractionary monetary. Okay, under monetary policy, which is contractionary, the objective is to decrease the economic activity via the money supply. Okay, so affecting the money supply, no, is of course through what? Open market operations, discount rate, reserve required ratio, or implementing directly an interest rate level or mandating, no, an interest rate, fixing the interest rate. Ayun. So there are 4 tools, no, to effect a monetary policy, no. In this case, it's contractionary. Okay, and when you say contractionary, it tends to lessen, no, the economic activities through the decreasing the money supply and the money demand. Okay, so let's see, no, step by step. It begins with the monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy begins with the decrease in the money supply. How does this happen? Increasing required reserve ratio, increasing discount rate, selling government bonds or treasury bills, and ano pa isa? Implementing, no, an interest rate, no, that is higher, implementing a higher interest rate. Yun yung directly nag-issue ng ano ng interest rate. Okay, fixing the interest rate. Okay, ayan, yan, no. Okay, so those are the ways, no, how the money supply is decreases. Okay, the decrease in the money supply increases the interest rate, increases, which leads to a decrease in the investment, decreasing output income, and decreasing the demand for money. So yan, connected, connect yan. Okay. Sometimes the government may implement a mix of policies, putting together any of these combinations, no, an expansionary fiscal with expansionary monetary, or a contractionary fiscal with an expansionary monetary, or a combination of contractionary monetary with expansionary fiscal, or a contractionary monetary with a contractionary fiscal. Okay, and then here we see the summary of the effects, no, with this mix of policies. With expansionary monetary means an increase in money supply. That's the objective. Increasing the money supply with expansionary monetary, coupled with expansionary fiscal, brings about an increase in income and an increase in consumption spending. But we're not sure about the effect on the interest rate and investment. That's why there are question marks here. Now, putting together contractionary fiscal with expansionary monetary, this is the effect. Decrease in interest rate, thereby increase in investment, but we're not sure about the effect on the output and on the consumption spending. Okay, another mix, no, is a contractionary monetary with an expansionary fiscal. This is the result. Increase in interest rate and decrease in investment, but we're not sure about the effect on output, income, and on the consumption spending. And finally, we have a combination of contractionary fiscal and contractionary monetary. And this is the result. Decrease in output and decrease in consumption spending of households. But we're not sure on the effect, its effect on interest rate and investment. Okay. The aggregate demand refers to the total demand for goods and services in the economy. And the aggregate demand curve is a curve that shows the negative relationship between aggregate output income and the price level. Each point on the AD curve is a point at which both the goods market and the money market are in equilibrium. Okay. Okay, here we have the aggregate demand curve, and what does each point sabi in the aggregate demand curve? Each point here along this curve represents equilibrium between the goods market and the financial market. Every point here, yan. So it's not a simple curve, no? Every point here is an equilibrium of the goods market and the financial market. Yan. Okay, first we have the first panel here, no? The first graph. We have the demand for money here along the horizontal, and we have the interest rate along the vertical. And which this means that the demand for money responds to the level of interest rate. The higher the interest rate, the lower the money demand. And the lower the interest rate, the higher the money demand. With the money supply constant, ito sabi, an increase in the price level, yan, increases the demand. An increase in the price level increases the demand for money from M0 to M1. Here, there is an increase in money demand. Yan. With the supply, this is the supply of money which is constant. The interest rate increases from 6% to 9%. There is an increase in the interest rate from 6 to 9%. But the money supply is constant. Okay, so what's the effect? Now, by the way, the increase in the money demand, no, is due to an increase in, of course, nominal income. But at a specific interest rate here, okay, interest rate, no change in interest rate, no, at let's say 6%, no, with an increase in the money demand, it's due to another factor, no, increase in money demand. But then, if there's an increase in the interest rate with money supply constant, okay, what is this intersection here? Sabi, the interest rate increases from 6 to 9%. An increase in the price level increases the demand for money. Yan. So ito pala, hindi nominal income. It's the price level that increased the demand for money. Sorry, kanina sabi ko nominal income. It's the price level that increased. No? The price level increasing, there's an increase in the demand for money. And then with an increase in the interest rate from 6 to 9%, it's really the price level, no, that led to the increase in the interest rate, the increase in the price level. Okay, here in the next graph, we have planned investment along the horizontal and interest rate along the vertical. By the way, the interest rate is the price of money. Okay, the higher the interest rate, okay, this point, the decrease in the investment. And the lower the interest rate, the higher the investment. And then here on the third graph, the relationship between aggregate output income and planned aggregate expenditure that you had seen, no, several times already. This is the effect of the increase in interest rate, no? At the higher, this represents the I sub O, no? So when at the lower interest rate, we have investment spending greater, okay? But then at 6% no, interest rate, it's because of the higher interest rate, we see a fall in the investment spending, which effectively decreases the aggregate expenditure and brings about a decrease in the aggregate income output here. So kanina, um, when before the increase in interest rate, investment spending uh, was um, was greater, and therefore we see a higher equilibrium output at this level. With the increase in the interest rate which led to the decrease in investment, this is now it decreases the output here. Now you see, this is now the new equilibrium. We have a lower output because of the decrease in investment, because of the increase in interest rate. Remember that our definition of aggregate demand is that the goods no and services, but then it's the equilibrium between financial market and goods market no. Every point every point along the aggregate demand curve represents the equilibrium between the goods market and the financial market. Um, and each of these equilibrium, contained in this curve, respond to price level here, the price level, increasing or decreasing. So we see here aggregate output. And the AD is inversely related to the price level. So the higher the price level here, the lower is the AD, and the aggregate output is at this lower level too. But at the lower price level here, the aggregate demand is higher at this level, which is wherein the aggregate output income is also higher. It is important that you realize that the aggregate demand curve, what the aggregate demand curve represents. It is more complex than a simple individual or market demand curve. The AD curve is not a market demand curve, and it is not the sum of all market demand curves in the economy. As I have said earlier, it represents the equilibrium between financial markets and the goods market. To understand what the aggregate demand curve represents, you must understand the interaction between the goods market and the money markets. These are the other reasons for a downsloping aggregate demand curve. First is the consumption link, which provides a reason for the downward slope. An increase in the price level increases the demand for money, which leads to an increase in the interest rate, which leads to a decrease in consumption, which leads to a decrease in aggregate output income. The initial decrease in consumption brought about by the increase in the interest rate contributes to the overall decrease in output. Planned investment does not bear all the burden of providing the link from a higher interest rate to a lower level of aggregate output, but its consumption. Because decreased consumption brought about by a higher interest rate also contributes to this effect. So it's not only about investment spending affected by interest rate, it's consumption that also reacts to interest rate. And consumption, of course, affects aggregate spending, which affects the aggregate output income. So interconnected. And another, it's not only consumption, we also include real wealth, the real wealth effect. This is the change in consumption brought about by a change in real wealth that results from a change in the price level. So changing the price level changes the real wealth, and the real wealth affects the consumption. At equilibrium, plant aggregate expenditure and aggregate output are equal. Alam na natin yan, no? Okay. Figure 27.7 shows the effect of an increase in money supply on the AD curve. Okay, so this means increase in money supply. Okay. So the increase in money supply has an effect on the aggregate demand. No? It increases the aggregate demand, shifting it to the right. This shift occurs because the increase in money supply lowers the interest rate, which increases plant investment and thus plant aggregate expenditure. The final result is an increase in output at each possible price level. Okay, so let's summarize it. Increase in money supply decreases the interest rate, which increases investment and consumption, which increases aggregate expenditure, which increases the aggregate income. Okay, this one illustrates the increase in government spending or decrease in taxes. This is expansionary. Yung kanina, expansionary din, no? Yung increase in money supply. And the increase in government spending or decrease in taxes also effectively increases the money supply. An increase in government purchases or decrease in net taxes causes aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Ayan, shift to the right. The increase in G increases plant aggregate expenditure, which leads to increase in output at each possible price level. A decrease in T, taxes, causes consumption to rise. The higher consumption increases aggregate expenditure, which leads to an increase in output at each possible price level. So to summarize again, increase in government spending or decrease in taxes increases the aggregate demand. The increase in aggregate demand increases the aggregate expenditure, which leads to increase in output, which increases the income. Okay. Here's the summary of shorthand summary of the factors that shift the aggregate demand curve. Expansionary monetary policy increases the money supply, which increases the aggregate demand curve. An expansionary fiscal policy, which is about increasing spending or decreasing government spending, increasing government spending or decreasing taxes, will increase the aggregate demand. Okay. On the other side, no, contractionary, monetary decreases the money supply, which decreases the AD curve. And a contractionary fiscal policy decreases government spending or increases taxes, decreases the aggregate demand. Okay, so that ends our presentation.